Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon,
And I'm Andy McNeil.
and we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Noah Cochron. Noah holds a Master of Social Work degree from the Smith College School for Social Work. For the last 6 years, Noah has primarily fostered relationships with young people, most recently as a therapist for high school students in the Bay Area, and as a traveling facilitator for college students studying abroad. He is co-founder of the COVID Grief Network, a volunteer-run organization that provides short-term grief support and long-term community for young adults who are grieving in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Noah believes in ritual, laughter alongside mourning, and being with big questions about how to be in the right relationship to each other and to our world. When not working in the grief world, Noah is a flower farmer, a book enthusiast, and a fledgling woodworker. Noah, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So Noah, again, thank you for being with us. Before we get into your work, I'd like to know if you would be kind enough to share with our audience your own personal grief experience.
Yeah, of course. So my experience with grief started when I was fairly young. When I was 11, my dad died unexpectedly. And that was already one experience of grief that felt like it sort of put me out of place from a lot of my peers. I didn't have a lot of friends at the age of 11 who had lost a parent. And then just 9 years later, when I was 20, my mom died unexpectedly. So I sort of entered into adulthood without parents. And those experiences of grief were so formative for me when I was very young, and have really, even more and more as I grow older, I see how much they've affected the path that I'm on in the world, and what it's like to be a young adult living in the world without any parents who are still living.
So do you think that experience has put you on the path that you are? And if you can explain more about that path?
Yes, definitely. So as you shared in my bio, I'm a social worker and a therapist, and I've known that I've wanted to go into the social work field since I was pretty young. Part of that is also because my grandmother is a social worker, so I had this early modeling of what it was like to be in relationship to people as a form of healing. And I think when I was younger and wanted to go into social work, there was a part of me that felt like, oh, here is a profession of people who sit with and bear witness to the really painful but real parts of life. And I think the parts of me that didn't have people sitting with me or wanted to meet other people who could connect with me over that was drawn to the field as a way to meet those early needs of mine. And over time that shifted as I've gotten to have more of my own community of other young adults who are grieving. And I still love the fact that I'm a social worker, and I'm really pulled into this work because I really believe in the power of relationships. And part of that is because I've lost really important people to me and felt the ways that relationships are really affected by death. And I believe and feel that my relationship with my parents continues to evolve over time, even though they've both died. But I also have this visceral understanding of how precious relationships can be, and how complicated and painful, and when someone has died, I think it highlights just how complicated those relationships can be, especially if they were in an unresolved place. And as a young person, I wasn't ready to lose my parents. I didn't really understand who they were as people yet. I didn't understand who I was as a person yet, separate from them. And so a lot of my work since then as a therapist and beyond has been guided by big curiosity about, oh, how are we really influenced by our experiences in the world, and how do we relate to other people because of those experiences, and what are the stories and the patterns we have that we bring with us into our relationships that are based on the stuff that happened to us when we were younger. And that's the part of connecting with other people that I'm most drawn to, and really is connected to how my experiences of big grief and also big love affected me as a young person.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, even to hear you say it in the way that you said it, about certainly having big losses and big love in your life, but to hear you describe the impact that the deaths had, not just on you emotionally or mentally or spiritually, but also just on your social life, on you and how you view yourself. And you mentioned those stories that we carry with us.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes are those thoughts in our head, like what we're telling ourselves about the situation and why it happened and all of those things. And I wonder, I'm just curious if you could share maybe just a little more on some of your own experience and how those things, maybe things that certainly shaped you, but also things that you found yourself saying, this is complicated and I need to work through this somehow, that maybe some of our listeners could even identify with, in that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me think about that for a moment. So the stories, I feel like the current position of life that I'm in my late 20s, graduated from grad school. I'm witnessing a lot of my peer group take some big steps in what's considered to be sort of hallmarks of adulthood, like being in partnerships, moving towards having families. If my friends are people who want families, buying homes, moving into career fields, and a new understanding I have of my own story is how I really wish that I had parents who could be mentors to me in this moment. And it's, I think, part of the story, part of what happens with my story is that it actually is just getting bigger as I get older. It's not that grief becomes more simplified or that I'm done with it. Grief is never over. It's not linear. And it actually, as I get older, just becomes more and more complicated as I uncover new layers of how my story feels different than other people's stories, and how, I can't just call my parents and talk to them about what their process was of a particular milestone in their adult life.
Right.
And so that's one aspect of how my story of myself is shifting right now and how it relates to grief. I think another part of maybe a story that I had to sort of move through because it was difficult is more the story of the relationships that I had with my parents. And my mom in particular had a lot of mental health challenges in her life. She used substances in a way that was really unsafe. And I had a lot of anger towards her, and a lot of the grief of our relationship is that didn't get to be resolved while she was still alive. And I was really mad at her when she died, and had been really mad at her for a couple of years before she died. And a big part of my story is in trying to offer myself forgiveness for that, and recognizing that I was just a kid and doing the best I could. But it feels sort of like our story got stuck there when she died. And I hear a lot of other people that I talk with who have experienced unexpected loss in particular. And that's something I think about a lot with my stories, is that both of my parents died very unexpectedly. And other people have stories of grief that are more extended, or maybe they knew that someone was going to die because they had a terminal illness, or which is just a different complicated grief. Neither one is easier than the other, but I think for me it's the stories got really locked in time based on when my parents died and when my relationship to them stopped having such easy access to new experiences, I guess. And so I've had to be creative in how I could shift some of that for myself as I've gotten older, and
Yeah.
connecting with other young people who have had similar experiences is the best way I have of trying to shift some of those stories for myself, because I can when I hear someone else talk about like, oh, I was really mad at my mom when she died, or we were in a fight, or the last thing I said to her was this, or like I never got to say this thing, I can have so much more compassion for that person than I often can for myself. And it's a good way for me to tap into being able to offer myself some of that, and also hear from someone else the things that I can't tell myself and believe, but maybe can hear from someone else, and that helps me.
Yeah. Well, all of those things are big parts of grief for so many people, right? And just it's interesting, years ago, there was a term that was passed around, unresolved grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I argued and said, wait, is it the grief that's unresolved? Because we're going to have grief, right? Grief is something that takes on different, versions throughout our life, depending on how old we are and what our circumstances are and what's going through, right? Or is it more that there are so many unresolved things
Mm-hmm.
that are just left unresolved because of a death, and we carry those with us? And what do we do with them?
Yeah, how do we come to terms with that?
Right.
How do we become kind to ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, somewhere along the way. So,
Yeah.
So, Noah, tell us about the COVID Grief Network.
Sure. So the COVID Grief Network is an organization that I'm lucky enough to be a part of starting. And the background of it is that in the last couple of years, I've had also the gift of facilitating some grief retreats for young adults who have had big loss in their lives with a now really good friend of mine, Chloe Zelka. And we were having conversations back in February about what comes next for us, how do we host a next retreat, and then the pandemic reached the United States, and we just started hearing about and seeing all of the death and all of the grief in the world, and expecting that grief would continue to happen. Of course, as the pandemic continued to affect the lives of people and continue to spread, and that's true now, 6 months later, as we're about to reach 200,000 deaths in the United States. And Chloe and I and some other close community in the grief world asked ourselves, how can we respond in this moment? What are our unique skill sets and passions in terms of offering support for grieving young adults in particular? Because as young adults ourselves, many of whom have experienced big loss, we all share a common thread of being really passionate about offering support to young adults. And part of that is because in the grief worlds, there's often a gap for offering grief support services to young adults. It's often a lot easier to find grief support for older adults or for children, but there's sort of this middle ground that there's something missing there. And often people in their 20s and 30s are the first in their peer group to lose someone. And so when we're thinking about what is a particular form of isolation that greets young adults who are grieving, how can we meet that? And the group of people who were talking about this, it was myself, who's a therapist, some really wonderful people who are in spiritual care practices as chaplains or rabbis, and then also some really brilliant organizers. And so we had this really unique fusion of mental health, spiritual care, and big thinker organizers. And based on some really beautiful organizing that was modeled by some other networks, including the New York City COVID Care Network, that were forming mutual aid networks, we decided that we wanted to start an organization that could offer free one-on-one grief support to young adults who were grieving in the face of COVID-19 in particular. And the way that we set that up is that we now have a really robust group of volunteer grief support workers who are willing and available to offer support to young adults who are grieving in the face of this pandemic. And it's just been beautiful to get to see people who really want to show up to this moment and offer what they can as we're all witnessing this grief and continue to anticipate more grief moving forward.
And how do young adults sign up for this?
Yeah, so we have a website. It's the COVID Grief Network, just covidgriefnetwork.org. And there's a sign up sheet there for both volunteers and for young adults who can tell us a little bit about who they are, what their grief is, who they're grieving, and then also some particular identity markers if they'd like to share, because we also recognize that this pandemic is affecting particular communities more than others, and particularly those who are already facing structural oppression. And so, as a way to try to meet the needs of communities that are the most impacted and can most benefit from support, and who are facing barriers to accessing services in our system, we have specific pods of volunteers available who meet particular identity markers. So
And
that
are
volunteers can connect.
Are these volunteers professionals in the field? Are they? I take it that they're free Zoom conversations. Just give us a little more about that for those in our audience interested.
Yeah, so it's really up to the young adults and what it is that they feel most comfortable with. It could be on Zoom, it could be on phone calls. Those are sort of the two platforms. So the option is it's all virtual, but some people are video shy, and so if they want to have conversations, that's fine. And then the people that they're being connected to, the volunteers, are all people who have training. They're not necessarily licensed, but they all are people who have experience and training in offering care, whether that's and volunteers or young adults can also choose, I want to be connected to someone with a mental health training background or a spiritual care training background. And if spiritual care, here's a particular denomination of spiritual practice that I would like to be connected to. So there's a lot of options, and young adults can feel assured that they are going to be connected to someone who can show up for them in grief and not be afraid to have those conversations. That's really what we believe.
Amazing.
Well, Noah, I tell you, it's very heartening to hear just about what you're doing, what the network's doing. There's a lot of things in life that we can't change, right? But we can give our time and our attention and our abilities to provide space for people who need it. And it's just very heartening to hear that. And I know Fran and I are always excited when there's people who are concerned about young adults in this space, because you are absolutely right. There's a lot for children and teenagers. There's a lot for other aged adults, but this has really been a neglected age demographic. And at the same time, we have statistics that bear out that this age demographic overwhelmingly experiences their first significant death in a young adult age group. So we certainly are heartened by you and Chloe and others who have taken the time to put this together. So we only have a few minutes left, and I did want to give an opportunity. I know you mentioned the website for those who might be interested in signing up, but if there are people interested in just connecting with you and your work, someone may be watching this show and want to make that connection, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do believe that through the COVID Grief Network website is the best way. If you want to be in touch with me directly, you can fill out a little contact form on our website and just note in there that you want to be connected to me, and I will get that email, and I'm happy to be connected to people who want to talk about this work or get involved somehow or hear about other things that I'm doing, or just be connected to young people, another young person who's experienced a big loss.
Great. Noah, again, we want to thank you for being a guest here at Let's Talk Death and for sharing your personal journey and the work behind COVID Grief Network.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy.
Of course.
And thank you to those who joined us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And with that, we again thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.